Please stand for the reading of the Gospel. The Gospel lesson for this Maundy Thursday is taken from the Gospel of John, the 13th chapter, beginning at the first verse. Now, before the festival of the Passover, Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart from this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The devil had already decided that Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, would betray Jesus. And during supper, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands and that he had come from God and was going to God, got up from supper, took off his outer robe, and tied a towel around himself. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was tied around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus answered, "You do not know what I'm doing, but later you will understand." Peter said to him, "You will never wash my feet." Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no share with me." Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head." Jesus said to him, "One who has bathed does not need to wash except for the feet, but is entirely clean. And you are clean, though not all of you." For he knew who was to betray him. For this reason he said, "Not all of you are clean." After he had washed their feet, he put on his robe and reclined again. And he said to them, "Do you know what I've done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for that is what I am. So if I, your teacher and Lord, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have set you an example, that you should also do as I have done to you. Very truly I tell you, slaves are not greater than their masters, nor are messengers greater than the one who sent them. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them." This is the gospel of the Lord. Please be seated. I don't always have titles for these sermons, but I have a title for this one. The title is Power Inverter. In our camper, for which we are incredibly grateful, we have a lot of blessings. There are amazing, comfortable, and convenient things, and many of these get taken for granted much of the time. A prime example of this is a rather small box sitting under the counters. It contains a fuse box and a transformer, a cooling fan, and a fairly sophisticated board of electronics. It quietly does its job without drawing any attention to itself, and the only time you notice it is if it breaks. It's called a power inverter. It takes alternating current power and it turns it into direct current power. It runs all of the appliances and the lights, and it pumps and all of the electrical items that run on 12-volt direct current. And basically, its job is simply to turn one kind of power into a different kind of power. It is an amazingly useful, very reliable, simple, and important device. Without it, nothing works. With it, everything works fine. Our gospel lesson today is a kind of parable of a power inverter. Everybody knows how power works in the world. To get things done, you need to get people to do the things you want them to do. There's more than one way to do that. There's different styles of power conversion, power production. In Jesus' time, Rome was at its peak, and it was the determiner and holder of power. Power was heavily centralized in Rome under Caesar. That was the real source of all power and authority, ultimately. When it came down to choices, power flowed in one direction. It was direct current only. And it had one purpose. It was, in fact, very unifying. The Roman Empire was very successful, and it lasted an incredibly long time. And it ruled a huge swath of humanity. All of the civilized world in Europe, all the way through into North Africa, into Asia. There were places outside, and those were kind of discounted as being barbarian. Even though the civilization in China had been running for several thousand years already. But no, that's outside the empire. But within the empire, control was very precise. It was irresistible and unstoppable. Slaves served their masters. Masters of slaves served their bosses. They served the regional governors. The governors, in turn, served national leadership, whoever was installed. And every one of those ultimately looked to Caesar in the chain of command. The buck stopped at Caesar's desk, Caesar's throne. Everybody knew how it worked, and that power flowed from the top, from this top. Now, theoretically, according to the philosophers, this system was established to care for the people, to care for the land, and that all things would flourish under the command of a strong, centralized, reliable government. And certainly, it established peace, because any challenge to the peace was immediately crushed with a rather short but very brutal war. And peace was reestablished. And it was once again safe to travel on the roads. As long as you paid your taxes, as long as you respected and served the empire. Caesar was supposed to act as a kind, if strict, parent to all of the empire, keeping everyone happy and well cared for. Oh, but power is so seductive. And absolute power, which is what Caesar held, is incredibly corrupting. Those who had power very often acted very selfishly. And those at the bottom and had no power suffered terribly and really had no recourse. It's an example of initial good intentions not getting realized. Our system looks very different. In democracy, power is supposed to flow from the bottom. It's supposed to be the opposite of the empire. It's an inversion That's how it's built to function. The people speak, and the leaders must listen. They must respond to the needs of the electorate. If not, they lose their job in the next election, at the least. And we call it responsible government. They respond to the needs of the people. And that's how it's supposed to work. But we know that in practice, it often gets distorted. Power gets concentrated into the hands of a small number of spectacularly wealthy and powerful individuals and companies. We have banks that are too big to fail, no matter what they do, and companies who reach that status too. They exercise a different kind of power, and it messes with democracy, pushing it towards something called feudalism, where the wealthy own the poor and the powerful ones control whoever is in office, and gradually it begins to look more and more like Caesar's empire. They have the gold and they make the rules. And power is not where it appears or is supposed to be. Over time, unless we take great care and work very hard, power ends up being not where it appears, not in the parliament, not in the legislature, not in the people, but in the boardroom and the back office where the secret deals are done. Decisions are all too often made with a handshake and a wink and an envelope under the table. So like Rome, our system is designed to work one way, and it gets distorted. In our gospel lesson today, Jesus confronts the kind of power that everybody knows and is used to, the kind that everybody understands and inverts it, changes it into something different. Because Jesus, the disciples know, is the Messiah, the anointed one, the one who is in charge under God. He is, in fact, the ultimate and complete one of authority. He can call on angels to bear him up lest he dash his foot against a stone. He, in fact, can call on 12 legions of angels. That's a lot of angels. And that's a Roman military size of unit. Let's say, just for rough estimates, 1,000 in a legion. There's a little more than that, it's more complicated. But immediately being able to call on 12,000 troops, he can do anything to defend himself. He can out-Caesar any empire and any emperor. He can outpower the powers. He can turn stones into bread. But those are precisely the kinds of power moves that Jesus was tempted to make by Satan himself. Instead, we read today how Jesus chooses to take the very lowest place in all of society, in all of the culture, the role of a slave, the lowest house servant, the one who deals with dirty feet. This is an ultimate power who would rather die than take up the abusive power that rules the world. And what is more, Jesus calls on us to do the same. That does not come naturally. He says, in fact, very clearly, slaves are not greater than their masters, Nonetheless, we are called to be servants and not masters. Messengers, he says, are not greater than those who send them, but we are to be messengers, not the ones who craft messages. Whatever our position, whatever our authority, this is our actual identity and role. We are to have the attitude and priorities of true servants. We, like Jesus, are called to be power inverters, to work in such a way that we overturn the powers and power structures so that the powerless are given authority. You see, our God takes sides. Our God is not impartial. Nowhere in our scriptures is God impartial. God chooses sides every time. God chooses to lift up the humble and the lowly, and to, in fact, cast down the rich and the mighty. Remember what Jesus' mom said in that great psalm. God frees slaves. God calls to those in bondage and says, "Come out into my kingdom." God closes plantations and sweatshops. God cuts the barbed wire of the fences around the labor camps and the prisons. God sets free the captives and pronounces judgments on every emperor, every ruler, every empire. May our hearts clearly hear the call of the one true servant king. May we have courage to take up our cross, our towel, our basin, and follow. Let us, as Christ's followers, be power inverters, changing power and following Jesus. Amen. We turn to our hymn of the day.